So let's assume that you have a sphere, and that sphere, this is a sphere, and superscribed around it is another sphere, right? This is a bigger sphere, and this sphere describes the position of the 12 carbon monoxides. So we have drawn only 8. Let's imagine that the other 8 are on the back side of the screen, so you're not able to see it. So you have a total of 12 carbon monoxides. And you have 3 iron atoms, 3 Fe atoms, and there are 2 spheres. So the same thing can be said for the M4CO12 unit or the M6CO16 unit of the cobalt. You have 6 cobalt atoms in a sphere, 6 cobalt atoms in a sphere, which would be described by this small sphere. Okay. And then there would be 16 carbon monoxides, which are in a bigger sphere, and that bigger sphere has the 16 carbon monoxides on the surface. So carbon monoxide complexes are very often characterized by infrared spectroscopy. And I have already mentioned that the free carbon monoxide has got a stretching frequency of 2.43 centimeter minus 1. Sorry, the touch is moving the screen forward. Let me just adjust. Yeah. So all the complexes where there is a terminal carbon monoxide, the stretching frequency comes down by about 300 centimeter minus 1. Between 50 to 300 is decrease. So we have a significant decrease in the stretching frequency of carbon monoxide. And if you look at the bridging carbon monoxides in the dicobalt octacarbonyl complex, for example, in the solid state, you see that there is a very clear decrease of the stretching frequency, even further from what you observe for terminal carbon monoxides. So this is almost behaving like a ketone. So this is around 1700 to 1850. I have rounded off these figures. In some books, you would find slightly different numbers, but I suggest that you remember round figures. Round figures are sufficient. You do not have to remember the exact number of the stretching frequency between 1700 and 1850 for a di-bridging or a ketonic type carbon monoxide, which is pictured here. And if you look at the triply bridging carbon monoxide, then you would find that they are very, very low, 1600 to 1700 centimeter minus 1. So depending on the metal, depending on the charge on the complex, we're going to see this in greater detail soon. Depending on the charge on the complex, depending on the other ligands which are present on the metal, all these factors play a role. The stretching frequency can come down by a very large value for bridging carbon monoxides. So you can recognize the presence of bridging carbon monoxides purely from the stretching frequency. So in a few complexes, in very few complexes, the stretching frequency of carbon monoxide is higher than the value of 2143 centimeter minus 1, is even higher than the value of 2143 centimeter minus 1. Now, we had argued that almost in all complexes, the stretching frequency goes down, but in few complexes, where the metal is found in a positive oxidation state, oxidation state, then the stretching frequency goes greater than 2143 centimeters minus 1. So this is unusual, and there are very few complexes, and we will have to discuss this separately in another class. So let me now tell you why carbon monoxide stretching frequency is such a valuable signature for metal carbon monoxide complexes. Not just a signature, but it also gives us insight into the structure of the molecule. For example, if I have two carbon monoxides, these two metal carbonyl stretches can couple with each other. So they can have a symmetric stretch if both carbon monoxides are stretching at the same time in a symmetric fashion, going back and forth. Then I could have a symmetric stretch, and if I have one contracting and the other one expanding at that time, so you have an asymmetric. So two different types of stretches are found for a metal dicarbonyl complex, which is having a trans geometry. So nu S and nu AS. And these two stretching frequencies turn out to be unequally populated. The stretching frequency energy levels are unequally populated. So as a result, the nu S stretching is less probable than the nu AS stretching frequency. So these two unsymmetrical bands are a very clear indication of a trans geometry for the metal carbonyls. On the other hand, if I have a cis geometry, it doesn't have to be an octahedral complex. I have an octahedral complex pictured here. Anything that varies from around 90 degrees to 110 degrees or so, or even 120 degrees, will have such a coupling of the two carbonyl stretching frequencies. So these two stretching frequencies are both symmetrical and unsymmetrical, the same type of stretching frequencies. One requires slightly higher energy. The symmetrical stretching frequency requires less compared to the asymmetric stretching frequency in this picture that I have drawn here. And it is the two stretching frequencies now have got equal probability, which means they are equally populated. The energy levels are equally populated at a particular temperature. So the intensities of the two bands are similar. This gives you an idea whether it is cis or trans. In the trans case, the intensity is much less. So that's why carbon monoxide complexes are extremely easily studied using infrared spectroscopy. Infrared spectroscopy is a very fast tool for characterization of these complexes. Similarly, if I have an ML3 complex, I can have a difference in the type of intensity between the number of bands and the intensity difference between the two symmetric and the asymmetric stretching frequencies. And so in the meridional form, which is, this is the meridional, isomer. There are two meridional planes which are bisecting each other perpendicular to one another. They're perpendicular to one another. So these type of complexes have got this pattern, whereas the facial isomer has got new symmetric and new asymmetric bands. So this is just to tell you that carbon monoxide complexes are well characterized by infrared spectroscopy fairly easily, and that's another reason why they're very popular with organometallic chemists. If I want to detect a carbon monoxide intermediate, metal carbonyl intermediate, I can use infrared spectroscopy. Now, unfortunately, NMR is very unfriendly in the case of metal carbonyl complexes. And the reason for this is because carbon is bound to a metal, and on the other side, it's bound to a oxygen. And there are no hydrogens close by. In most organic compounds, the carbon resonance is enhanced by the presence of a hydrogen close by. The flipping of the hydrogen from the higher energy level to the lower energy level, back and forth, that enhances the relaxation of the carbon-13 signal. And so the intensity of the carbon-13 signal, which is already hampered by a very low natural abundance. The natural abundance of carbon-13 is only 1%. So for every 100 molecules of a metal carbonyl, only one of them is likely to be having a carbon-13 atom. So the intensity of the signal is already very low. And to add to that, the relaxation of the carbon-13 from the higher energy state to the lower energy state is also very slow. And so the signal gets saturated very fast, and a very weak signal is observed for metal carbonyl complexes. One way people try to overcome this difficulty is by adding a paramagnetic impurity into the solution. Now, this is not always recommended. If you have a paramagnetic metal in solution, it can cause a paramagnetic shift. If your analyte of interest is going to interact with the chromium, then the chromium ACAC thrice, which is a paramagnetic species, this is a paramagnetic species, this will induce rapid relaxation of the nuclei from the higher energy level to the lower energy level. But then, if the other ligands are interacting with the chromium, then those chemical shifts will also be drastically shifted. So this is not a recommended practice, but if I want to observe a metal carbonyl complex and I cannot see it at all, this is a possibility. Okay, so this is a possibility. Now, we have talked a lot about the structure of these molecules. The bond distances being shorter than what sorry, I think my screen went blank. Yeah. So bonding and formation of metal carbonyls is what we are talking about. And let me briefly tell you that these molecules are not always easy to synthesize. There are two metal carbonyls which are fairly easy. But apart from that, the others are a little difficult. And I'll tell you the reason for this difficulty. Iron is easy. If you have iron metal as powder or even pieces, you could pressurize those at 200 atmospheres pressure of carbon monoxide and heat it also, and you can form a golden yellow compound, which is FeCO5. What we have done here is that we have directly reacted iron metal and generated metal carbonyl. But notice that you require significantly high temperature. If I have very pure iron, then it reacts at room temperature. But this is very difficult to get. This purity is extremely difficult to get. So usually people generate it using this method. Most of you would have read about the Mons process. Nickel, impure or pure, will react at room temperature with CO to produce NiCO4. So this is the Mons process, because if you heat it, you can get pure nickel plus CO. So in order to get pure nickel, you can take impure nickel, treat it with carbon monoxide and get nickel tetracarbonate. Now this is very dangerous, a very dangerous reaction, because you cannot put carbon monoxide in any reaction vessel understanding the composition of the steel tube through which the gas is being passed. Many steel tubes, many steel vessels have got a small amount of nickel, because nickel strengthens increases the strength of iron. So instead of making a pure iron cylinder, people alloy it with nickel and make stronger cylinders. But you cannot put carbon monoxide in it, because slowly the carbon monoxide will eat away the metal, and then you will end up with a cylinder which is very porous, or it can be even so weak that it can break. So nickel cylinders or nickel containing iron cylinders are not used for storing carbon monoxide. They require a special metal, special alloy without any nickel. Now, the principle that we use for making metal organometallic compounds in alkyl chemistry is similar to the principle that we are using here. What we are doing is we are taking nickel in +2 oxidation state and reducing it with this sulfite salt and generating a nickel carbonyl compound, where nickel is reduced and carbon monoxide is being added to the nickel. First nickel 0 is generated, and then nickel 0 in the presence of carbon monoxide reacts to give nickel carbonyl. Similarly, here carbon monoxide itself is used as the reducing agent. This is the reducing agent. Because carbon monoxide can be converted into CO2 by oxygen. So carbon monoxide itself is acting as a reducing agent. But notice the temperature at which these reactions are happening is very high. Here sodium is used. Sodium, these are expensive methods of making, but in this particular case, it has been used because it's also ending up as the counter ion, for sodium. Sorry, the chromate salt. Here, CrO4 minus is being formed. Chromium is formally in the -4 oxidation state. Fairly unusual complex. It's extremely reactive, and it is just given here as an example. It's not something that you commonly encounter in the laboratory. Now the question is, why do these molecules form carbon monoxide? Because the heat of formation of carbon monoxide is very high, and it is stable by itself. It has got a very small dipole moment, and if you look at the dipole moment, this is delta minus and this is delta plus. So contrary to what you expect, oxygen being more electronegative, the dipole moment is not in the direction of the oxygen. The negative charge is not in the direction of the oxygen. It is in the direction of the carbon. So this is a surprising thing. Why is it that carbon monoxide is able to form a complex with iron, which has got a very high lattice energy? So these all the metal atoms require very high temperature to volatilize them. If you want to separate the iron into separate iron atoms, you will require extremely high temperatures. And that's why you cannot have direct reaction. Usually you end up reducing the metal salt to where a very reactive metal atom is formed, and that metal atom reacts with the carbon monoxide. So this is, if you take the analog nitrogen, dinitrogen, this is N2. The dinitrogen does not form such metal complexes very quickly. Carbon monoxide forms it more readily. And it's very difficult to protonate carbon monoxide. So you can form HCO+. HCO+ is the protonated form of carbon monoxide. So sure, you can protonate it, but that's not the stable, it's not a stable entity, the formyl cation. So why is it that metal forms such carbon monoxide complexes easily and it forms such strong bonds? These are fairly strong bond energies that we see. As I told you, the metal is also having a very high heat of vaporization. So M solid to M gas requires a very large amount of energy. And except for nickel and iron, none of them will do it directly with the metal. So these are two exceptions, nickel and iron. But iron has to be extra pure, extra pure. So these are 99.999 purity, pure metal atom. Okay, so these are not ordinary purity. So if you take the average enthalpy, I think in the previous slide I have made a mistake. I have given you in value in kilojoules per mole. I will correct it. Here it is in kilocalories per mole. So kilojoules will be about 4 times as much. So you find that the average bond enthalpy for one metal carbon bond is close to 25 kilocalories per mole. So they are fairly strong. And what is interesting is just like the metal carbon bond strength increased for alkyls, here also it increases. So I don't have the value for everything, but in this case you have very nice complexes, so it's easy. Structural parameters, I've already explained this to you. These bond distances are significantly shorter than what you expect. This is the expected value. And the expected value is calculated from this, these two independent covalent bond radii. So if you take the iron covalent bond radius, that's 1.43 angstroms. And for sp carbon, it is 0.67. So you add the two, you get 2.1. And what you observe in iron carbonyl is fairly short. Significant what you single bond. So the bond distance in the metal carbon bond distances are shorter, but the carbon oxygen distances do not change too much. Okay, carbon oxygen bond distances do not change too much. That looks as if carbon monoxide itself is not significantly perturbed by the bonding. Usually it ranges between 1.14 and 1.16, and that is 0.02 angstroms lengthening, not 2 to 0.04 angstroms lengthening. So that's not a significant increase, but nevertheless, crystallographically significant, which means these structures have been determined fairly accurately. I have summarized in this slide all the factors that we have discussed so far. You can go through them one by one and also listen to the video. So I'm not going to explain all of these, but these factors have to be accommodated when we try to look at the bonding between the metal and the carbon monoxide. And as I told you, the carbon end is bonded and not the oxygen end, which could be explained by the dipole moment, but there is a better reason why that is the case. All these factors have to be taken into account when we look at bonding in carbon monoxide organometallic chemistry. So briefly, let me tell you about carbon monoxide electronic structure, because most of you should have studied this in fairly great detail. Just to recap, I want to tell you that there are sigma and pi bonds very clearly separated out in carbon monoxide because of the high symmetry of the molecule. So the sigma and pi can be well separated. And we have not included in this figure, which is taken from Shriver, Atkins, and Langford, included the core orbitals. The oxygen 1s and the carbon 1s are the core orbitals, which means they are not significantly involved in bonding. So we are not going to consider them in the molecular orbital picture that we are drawing here. So we start with 1 sigma. 1 sigma is the combination of the oxygen 2s and the carbon 2s. So because oxygen is more electronegative, oxygen will contribute more and carbon will contribute less. So this is, let's call it CO. So that's the geometry that we are talking about. I've drawn the bond only to indicate the axis. So you have the 2s of oxygen and the 2s of carbon mixing together to form a nice bonding molecular orbital. That is this one. Now it turns out that the anti-bonding combination of the 2s mixes with the 2pz of oxygen and the 2pz of carbon, and these two interact and they form 2 sigma orbitals. So the sigma manifold, 1 sigma, 2 sigma, 3 sigma, they are formed by a combination of the s and the sp. This second orbital significantly mixes with the p orbital. So that gives you 2 sigma and 3 sigma. We'll look at the character of these orbitals shortly. But what I want to tell you is the following. In the valence bond picture, we talked about hybridization. And hybridization is the mixing of the S and the P. In the case of molecular orbital theory, although we do not call it hybridization, the mixing of 2 orbitals having the same symmetry occurs. So this is the net result, or the net understanding is going to be similar. But pi, on the other hand, is perpendicular to the sigma. So there are 2 pi orbitals, but that's the first pi orbital in the molecule. The first pi orbital in the molecule, I think I should use a different color to indicate that. This is a first pi orbital, and that is perpendicular to the sigma, and it's perpendicular and orthogonal. In mathematical terms also, the functions are orthogonal. geometrically they are perpendicular. So the pi doesn't mix at all with the sigma, and there are 2 pi orbitals. And if I consider this as the z-axis by convention, these two will be pi x and the pi y. Okay, so this is the first one is going to be occupied. If you fill up the number of electrons, 6 from carbon and 8 from oxygen, you will end up with the right number to fill up on all these energy levels. And the highest occupied molecular orbital is going to be this 3 sigma. Highest occupied molecular orbital is going to be this 3 sigma. And the lowest unoccupied molecular orbital is the pi molecular orbital. So we'll put a star to indicate the pi star. So before I go further, I should tell you that carbon monoxide is indeed an amazingly unique molecule, because it straddles the region where the sp mixing is happening to a great extent, and on one side, on the oxygen side, it doesn't happen to a significant extent. So carbon monoxide is a combination of carbon and oxygen. Carbon mixes S and P, oxygen doesn't mix S and P. So carbon and oxygen mix just the right amount in order to generate the highest occupied molecular orbital of carbon monoxide, which has got the right symmetry and the properties. So this figure is also important for you to understand. I would like you to brush up your homonuclear diatomics. We are going to discuss dinitrogen, which is of course isoelectronic with carbon monoxide. So I would like you to go ahead and go through this figure and also the accompanying explanation in chapter 1 of Shriver, Atkins, and Langford. So that talks about homonuclear diatomics. So I have computed the shapes of these molecular orbitals. Today I will discuss the energy levels and the shapes. If you do a simple MO calculation, in this case I have done what is the simplest one, which is the extended Huckel calculation. I can show you that the 1 sigma orbital is going to have this form, mostly on the oxygen, very little on the carbon. So you'll notice that this is carbon on the left and oxygen on the right. Similarly, the 2 sigma is the one which is mixing with the pz. If this is the z-axis, then this is mixed with pz. As a combination of S and pz, and this gives you the antibonding orbital, which has got this type of a geometry, this type of contributions from the 2 atoms. Carbon contributes more this time and oxygen contributes less this time. If I now go to the 3 sigma again has got more combination from carbon and less from oxygen. So this is predominantly present on the carbon side. So remember, this is carbon, this is oxygen side. So the one at minus 13.02 electron volts, minus 13.02 indicates how much energy you require in order to pull the electron out from that molecular orbital. So that's the HOMO. This is my HOMO, and the HOMO is having this type of a character. Now notice, because that is a HOMO, it is easiest to donate electron density from CO to any species from the carbon side. That is why HCO plus also had the structure of H bonded to carbon, bonded to oxygen. HCO plus and MCO are all bonded with carbon bonded to the metal rather than in the oxygen. That because that's the one which can donate electron density. That's the highest occupied molecular orbital. That's the one from which you will remove electron density from. So let's look at now the pi molecular orbitals. There is only one bonding molecular orbital that I have, and that will also have greater contribution from the oxygen. This figure is not very clear, probably because of the orientation, but this has got greater contribution from the oxygen side. Let me amplify it for emphasis. More contribution from the oxygen side and less contribution from the carbon side. So that's the nature of this orbital here. It has got more contribution from oxygen and less contribution from carbon. Whereas the pi star orbital, this is the pi star orbital, has got more contribution from carbon and less contribution from oxygen. Now, the reason why we are emphasizing the pi star, it's because this is the LUMO. This is the lowest unoccupied molecular orbital. And if electron density has to be pumped from the metal into the carbon monoxide, it will go into the LUMO, right? So, in order to explain the multiple bonding, you see that the sigma has got only one favorable interaction, and that is donation of electron density from the HOMO. So the pi bond is formed from donation of electron density from the metal to the LUMO of the carbon monoxide. So, so let's look at the metal orbitals. Here I'm going to use something called what I call as the 3M approach, or the Mickey Mouse molecular orbital picture. What I have done is I have taken the valence orbitals of chromium and I have pre-arranged them or prepared them for bonding to 6 carbon monoxides. I have taken 2 d orbitals, s and 3 p orbitals, mixed all of them together, and they will have an average energy of this value in between the s and the p and the d. So they will have this average energy, and they will have 6 hybrid orbitals. So these are 6 hybrid orbitals that are formed by chromium in order to, and all of them are vacant. So in order to form 6 vacant orbitals, I leave behind what's called the T2G set of orbitals, which you're all familiar with from coordination chemistry, valence in crystal field theory. The T2G set are the dxz, dyz, and the dxz orbitals. And these orbitals lying between the axes are now left unhybridized or unmixed, and they are the ones who are going to have the 6 valence orbitals of chromium. Valence electrons of chromium, sorry. So the 6 valence electrons of chromium are seated here, and the 6 empty orbitals of chromium are generated from D2sp3, and that will give you an octahedral hybrid. So every carbon monoxide that comes in along the axis can now interact with an empty orbital on the metal. So this is the metal, and there are 6 empty orbitals. Now, these are hybrid orbitals, so all of them are empty, and they can accept electron density from the carbon monoxide into the metal. So this is a sigma interaction. Sigma interaction, because any amount of rotation along this axis will not change or will not affect the overlap of the carbon 3 sigma orbital with an empty metal orbital. These two overlaps will not change any amount of rotation along this axis. So this is called a sigma interaction. On the other hand, you can also have pi bonding, and the pi bonding is between the excuse me. The pi bonding is between the metal T2G set of orbitals and the T2G. I have missed one figure, I think. Okay. I didn't miss it, drawn it in the other direction, sorry. So this is the metal, and if I have, this is the pi star orbital, I can have a interaction between the filled metal orbital and the empty ligand orbital, which is the pi star. This is the LUMO. So this is the HOMO of the metal. The T2G set of orbitals are having 2 electrons each, and they can pump in electron density into the pi star or the LUMO of the carbon monoxide. Since this is the pi star, the population of the pi star will reduce the bond order between carbon and oxygen. Reducing the bond order leads to increase in the CO bond distance. It also weakens the CO bond. This weakening of the CO bond will also result in lower stretching frequencies. So what we have explained, or what we are able to explain, is the fact that we can have a lower stretching frequency for carbon monoxide because of this pumping in of electron density from the T2G to the pi star, and also have increases in the CO bond distance. So infrared spectroscopy is explained, and we are also able to explain the fact that there is a give and take of electrons, which results in a neutral metal atom giving a pair of electrons into the pi star of CO. This is also the reason why you have a sigma bond and a pi bond, and the two are flowing in opposite directions. Metal to, that sigma bond is between CO to metal, and the pi bond is between metal to CO. So these two are acting in opposite directions. So if I have a species which is able to push electron density into the pi star, it will form better complexes. And that is why neutral and negatively charged species formed very good compounds. And this is very nicely explained by the Dewar, Chat, Duncanson model of bonding. It's a give and take of electrons. It's almost like anthropomorphic. You give and take, both people gain. So in this case, the metal has gained, the carbon monoxide has gained, and you have the whole complex has gained, and so you have the formation of a nice complex. Okay, so now we have not explained really why 18 electron complexes dominate, but if you recollect the stability of, let me just go to this picture. The pi star orbital on carbon monoxide with the T2G set will stabilize it. And the lowest unoccupied molecular orbital on the ligand, that is going to be pushed up in energy. So the gap between the LUMO and the HOMO is very large in metal carbonyl complexes. Delta is large. As a result, many of them are absorbing only in the UV region. They're colorless. And because the gap is very large, there is no possibility for forming, if you have 18 electrons, they will always pair. Unless there is an odd number of electrons, as in VCO6, they will always pair together to form a diamagnetic complex. So the magnetism is explained, the short bond length is explained because of the formation of double bonds. Several of these factors are all nicely explained by the metal carbonyl bonding. We will talk about a little more of this intricacies of metal carbonyl bonding. I have already explained to you why the carbon end is interacting with the metal. If you recollect the pi star orbital has got a larger lobe on the carbon side. So this leads to better overlap. So unless the carbon side is bonded to the metal, you will not have such a good interaction between the metal and the carbon monoxide. So not only is the sigma bond better, the pi bond is also better when I have metal interacting with carbon end of carbon monoxide. So that factor has also been explained. So carbon has got a larger lobe. So this interaction is better. And the pi interaction is also better. All interactions are maximized when you have MCO interacting the way in which it does. Okay, I'm going to stop here and I'm going to show you how you can use the orbital for orbital viewer program for let me unshare this. Okay, let me ask you, is there any question that you would like to ask?
So what did you call that method in which the metal is on a sphere and the carbon monoxide are on a bigger concentric sphere? You call that some new surface method, whose name I'm forgetting.
Shubham, you're not very clear. Can you just type out the question in the chat box? I will meanwhile share the other thing.
Sir, I think he's asking the tensor harmonic, that name of that model.
Oh, tensor surface harmonics. So that's the mathematical model which describes the position of the carbon monoxides and the metals in two separate spheres. Tensor surface harmonic theory. The application of tensor surface harmonics to metal carbonyls is not very popular, but it was done a long time ago. And somewhere around 80s. And this was published in organometallic progress in organometallic chemistry a long time ago. Okay, so I hope you're able to see my screen. And what I wanted to show is the, so this is the, anytime you want to draw an orbital, you first start the orbital viewer program. That is just called orbital viewer, OV, in my computer. This comes as OV. You want to draw a new orbital, you have to press the button which is labeled with psi. press side, and then you can mix two orbitals by simply adding. So I'm going to add now. This is the dz squared orbital. I'm going to add now, and the second atom is positioned in the same place. So the second atom is positioned in the same place, and I'm going to keep it as a proton. It doesn't really matter, but keep it as a proton. And I'm going to keep the s orbital simple. So n is also 1. N is also 1, and s is done. And then I'm going to say done. So now we are generating S plus D. You can see that the screen is slowly populating. It's calculating the electron density at various positions for an SD orbital. And that's how you can generate. This is almost looking like a d orbital only this ring has become bigger. Okay, so now let me make that minus. So S minus D. Let me see if that can be done. So I have put factor as -1, and I say done. If I don't get it right, I could be mixing. I should be mixing. I think 3s might have been a better choice. I'm sorry, I will do this again. I think 3s would be a better choice. The reason why 3s is a better choice is because the 1s is deeply buried. Okay, now you got. So I'm mixing 3s and 3d. Okay, so now you can see that the shape has significantly changed. So if I want to do the same thing with +1, the factor is 1. Now I say, now the other lobe increases. Okay, so this is how you create a hybrid orbital using the orbital viewer. So what you do is you add atoms in the same position. The position is indicated by the place that I'm giving here, x, y, z equals 0. All of them are made as 0. So two atoms are, because this whole program works only by adding mathematical functions. It's not a calculation the way in which the a molecular orbital calculation is done. It's just adding linearly wave functions. So atom 1 was a 3D function, and atom 2 was a 3s function. And then you can see that the two are adding together to give you the two orbitals that I have shown for you. Okay, so that's how you make hybrid orbitals using the orbital viewer. Any questions?
Is there any way to display the axis, the XYZ axis in the, like I couldn't find it.
I have not done it. No. I have not seen it being drawn.
Okay.
There are other programs which show the axis. Maybe display. Let me see if display. You can cut. You can cut the orbital in a plane. Those kind of things can be done. Axis, I don't see. I'm sorry, I have not explored the possibility of showing the axis. Any other question? In fact, I have only used this program for generating hybrid orbitals. I have not used it for other purposes, but I think it's quite a nice program. It was done by a mechanical engineer, not a chemist. So just for like a hobby, he has done this. So, any other question? Yes.
So, in the metal carbonyl complexes, we have examples where carbonyl it acts.
Sorry, your voice is lost.
Yeah, the satisfaction of the 18 electron rule shouldn't be the only reason for a carbon monoxide ligand to act as a bridging or the terminal ligand, since in both the cases it is a 2 electron donor. So, what exactly determines whether in a given complex we will have carbon monoxide as a terminal ligand or a bridging ligand? Like, is it dependent upon the nature of the metal? Or is it something else responsible for that?
Okay. Let me quickly tell you an answer. One is the fact that terminal and bridging seem to be almost equally facile. The tensor surface harmonic theory actually seems to suggest that it doesn't matter whether it is found in a bridging position or in a terminal position. Okay, so they seem to be energetically equivalent. But when you have very large metal atoms, the metal atoms are very large, and the separation between the two are large, then bridging becomes unfavorable. Okay, so for metal atoms which are, for example, osmium, the corresponding complex is not bridging, not having any bridging carbon monoxides. In this example, for here that I have Fe3CO12, there are two bridges. In the osmium example, same structure, there are no bridges. So that is explained by the size of the metal atom. So if the metal atom is very far apart, then bridging becomes more difficult. If the metal atoms are closer, then bridging is easy. That is one explanation that is given.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Electronically speaking, there seems to be very little energy difference between the two.
Okay. Yeah, okay, fine. Thank you, sir.
Any other question? Otherwise, we'll close here.
Sir, one last question. So in case of the CO bond in the metal carbonyls, we saw that the stretching frequency reduces to a large extent, somewhere in around 300 centimeter inverse up to that. But the bond distance hasn't really changed much. When we looked at it that way, we felt like the CO isn't perturbed very much by the bonding. So why is that contrast happening? Shouldn't both of the factors be governed by the same principles?
Yes. So we have not explained everything about carbon monoxides. The last factor that I told you about, which is the charge effect. Okay, if I have, I think I mentioned this towards the end. If I have some complexes like AgCO2 plus, okay, AgCO2 plus. The stretching frequency nu CO is actually higher. Okay, and they have in fact short CO bonds. Okay, so there seems to be multiple effects operating. So that is what we're going to discuss. I'll discuss this paper as well as the other factors that are going on. So it's not, we have explained several of these points. DCT model explains several of these points, but it doesn't explain everything. So I think we will encounter some more points to discuss soon.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, otherwise we'll close here.